I started my career in Boise, Idaho, 21 years old. I want to get into real estate. I knew I did. I spent a semester at Boise State, realized I'm not learning anything about real estate. I want to learn the industry. So I got into brokerage, doing small ball residential investment properties. And I bumped into a developer and he said, I can't find land right now. No one has land available. If you can bring me a land deal, then I'll look at it. And I appreciated the challenge. And so I went out and started knocking doors and talking to farmers. And the next thing you know, I brought him a land deal. And then it was two. And in a matter of a couple of years, I had a fairly thriving land brokerage business going on. And then the crash came. My business dried up. I had this client who liked me. I liked him. He had the foresight to delever prior to the crash. And so he came to me and said, hey, Spencer, what opportunities are out there? I'd spent some time in Latin America. And so I'd never been to Panama, but we started looking at different markets for building for, if you will, working class, kind of this emerging middle class that's happening in Latin America. And everything pointed to Panama. This client of mine, he said, hey, Spencer, I like it, but I want someone down there I can trust. And so I'll do it, but I want you to go down there, set it up and run it. And that's what got me to Panama. And I spent 7 years running a home building company down there. Started it from scratch. Eventually, we had 50 people that were working for our company. I really enjoyed my time down there. Amazing people. Absolutely love Panama. I wouldn't change for the world.
And yet, the purpose of this conversation is to talk about institutional. So was there a certain tipping point for you that you said, okay, I'm getting out of development?
Yeah. So there's a couple things that drove that. The first was, in Panama, there was a ceiling in terms of the size and scopes of deals that I could do. And I'd always dreamed bigger. So while I loved the people I worked with, there were smaller deals than I had aspirations of working on, right? I wanted to work on trophy assets in gateway markets. That was exciting to me. And I just wasn't doing that, building 900 square foot tract homes, if you will, for working class folks. And it was rewarding for other reasons, but it wasn't where I wanted to go. So that was the first, really the size and scope of what I was working on. The next thing was I learned that I enjoy the analysis. I enjoy identifying where value can be added. I enjoy looking at the deal, but more from a 30,000 foot view, if you will. And I was just too close to the asset. So you learn this in development, especially if you're the guy where the buck stops. You end up putting fires out most of the time. Anytime something went wrong, I was the one who had to deal with it. And I got away from what I enjoyed, which is the analysis and understanding the real estate and identifying opportunities. And it was just dealing with little tiny things, little problems. And the great developers you'll find, they are phenomenal at getting past problems, because in development, you don't know what problems are going to arise. And while I was able to do it, I didn't enjoy it. And so the institutional side of real estate gave me the opportunity to step back, maybe not be so close to the asset, get into the analysis side of the business. And you can tell from my website, I enjoy analysis.
That comes through loud and clear.
Yeah. So those were the two reasons that pushed me from a development in kind of a small family office type atmosphere to the institutional side of the business.
Until fairly recently, I didn't know what institutional real estate was. We know what brokers are, appraisers, builders, developers. What is institutional real estate? And tell us about the company that you're at right now and what that means on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are a fireman and you're expecting a pension at some point in time, or you have a retirement account. You're expecting that money to grow and eventually provide you a return when you retire, right? And so you have an institution that represents those funds, and they're out there and they're investing in different asset classes. And one of the asset classes they invest in is real estate. And institutions right now hold about 10% of their assets on average, and it varies by institution. About 10% of their assets they hold in real estate. And
that's a development, right? It's grown quite a bit, the percentage over the past, 20, 30 years?
Oh yeah, early 80s, it was just a couple percentage points. It's grown now to nearly 10%, and it'll continue to grow. So these are institutions, right? Life insurance policyholders, retirement foundations, or endowments through university, et cetera, right? These are
big piles of cash that have to get invested so that you beat inflation, so that you have something to give back to the people who gave you this pile of money in the first place. And you specialize in the real estate part of that investment of the big cash.
Absolutely.
I understand that when you get this big pool of cash and some of it's going to stocks and some of it's going to bonds and some of it's going to real estate, even once you earmark 10 or 11% for real estate, I know there's different things that you can do with it to try to help it grow. What are those different departments that you get into in institutional, different ways that institutions try to invest in real estate?
Yeah, so if you think about the real estate risk spectrum, you've got development on one side, that's the riskiest investment. And then you have core stabilized properties. These are, and typically trophy assets. So
buying something that already exists,
dependable.
Dependable.
It's in a market such as Manhattan where there's just a demand that doesn't go away, et cetera, right? So there's this spectrum of risk, and we need to look at our portfolio and think about, okay, where do we want to invest our dollars to give the best risk-adjusted returns that are going to protect the investment of, in our case, policyholders, but other case, pension holders, small-time investors, teachers, et cetera, who are accounting on this money. They want to make sure that their principal is preserved, but then they get a decent risk-adjusted return. So we're looking at that. We're allocating some to development. We're allocating more to core investments. In our case, we also do debt. So sometimes your equity, which is riskier, sometimes your debt investments. We do some debt, we do some equity. And so we cover the risk spectrum, and most institutions do. But they'll allocate as sound portfolio theory. They're going to allocate less to the riskier and more to the less risk, so that they get a nice risk-adjusted return that makes sense for whatever constituent or stakeholder that they're investing.
So big pile of cash, 10 or 11% goes to real estate, and then of that portion, some is going to new construction development, some's going to buying buildings and repairing and flipping and whatever, and some's going to lending, just like a bank would, and you're making the interest money.
Right. And really, we think about debt very similar to how you think about equity. It's still an investment in real estate. It's just a safer investment. So if equity is the last dollar at risk, when you have debt, you are the least risky dollar in, right? So you're the first dollar to come out of that investment.
You hinted at it, but I'm sure another topic that people wouldn't know about is the idea of a capital stack. You said, when the dollars go in. Can you break down, just for people who watch who don't have the background, what do you mean when the dollars go in and all that? What is a capital stack and how does it work?
Think of a $100 investment. You as an owner of that want the ability to get some leverage, right? So you're going to go out and you're going to borrow other people's money to make that investment. So you might have, let's say it's a $100 investment. You might borrow $50. And so now you have $50 in equity. Someone else has $50 in debt, and they're getting a fixed return on that $50, and you're getting a variable return because your equity based on what's left after paying the fixed return to the debt holder.
So the developer, for example, their money goes in first, and then their partners who are helping them make the down payment, and then maybe the city if they have a TIF or something, and then the bank is last in the case of debt. We recently had some guys come speak here on campus, and they were talking about the idea in their investment strategy of being the big fish in the small pond, secondary, tertiary markets, because it's slightly riskier, they thought, but so as a result, there's a higher return. And they also tried to always make sure that they knew at what level the ultra big investors were going to start taking interest, and they always want to be below that because they don't want to cross blades, with those other people. The difficulty with that is, of course, that if you have a growth mandate or a growth interest and you want to keep getting bigger and bigger, you're invariably, A, going to have a hard time finding deals that are big enough in non-San Francisco markets, and B, you're going to have to start crossing blades with those other people because you're growing and growing and growing. And we've also had, the Blackstones of the world come and speak, and their funds are so big that where can they spend it? It's like that Richard Pryor movie, where he has all this money and he has to spend it. Like, at some point, I don't have enough stuff to buy. How do you as a company think about growth?
I can't speak for my company, but I can certainly speak in general about this topic, and that's this is a common problem on a couple fronts. First off, there's a finite supply of real estate,
right,
and yet a growing pool of capital seeking out real estate. And so
exactly.
What's the result of that? Compressing cap rate or shrinking returns. And so certain people are getting pushed out of markets because their return expectations are higher than what they can get in that market.
Yeah.
What ends up happening, and you saw this actually in the last recession, dumb money as we call it, money that maybe doesn't have
Can't find a good
maybe
home.
doesn't understand real estate to the point where they should be investing in real estate. That enters the market, and they're buying at valuations that just don't make sense, and the smart money leaves. And you see some of that happening today. I don't want to make any forecast because it'll be wrong, but certainly that's a challenge that happens. And so then to your second point about where do you go from there, what we saw happen with the last recession is the larger institutions, the institutions who maybe have a global reach, started looking at markets outside the U.S.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times it's going where the cycle makes sense, where the returns are, where the risk-adjusted returns make sense. And so you saw that happening 2011, 2012, institutions moving into Europe that hadn't gone to Europe before. You saw institutions going to Asia that hadn't been in Asia before. And then on a micro scale, like you said, you got big fish and small ponds who are in, let's take Nashville as an example. Nashville hadn't traditionally been an institutional market, meaning there weren't a lot of institutions investing in Nashville.
Trying to buy
and
stuff,
so
yeah.
There were big fish in a small pond, fantastic real estate investors who all of a sudden were kind of squeezed out when the institutions arrived. Well, they actually did pretty well because institutions were willing to buy maybe at valuations that the local guys weren't willing to buy. But then their ability to reinvest and continue to make returns gets harder, right? So yeah, I mean that happens in the United States and across the world, on small scales and on large scales. And we as real estate professionals, it's really about keeping up with what's happening in the capital markets, what's happening in the real estate markets, where we are in the cycle, et cetera, so that we can see these things happening and prepare for them and invest wisely based on our understanding of what's going on.
When I go to these real estate conferences and people start talking about the market cycles, people talk about, we got 18 months or we got 2 years, and everybody's like, vaguely saying, yeah, it's coming. Do institutions have the same kind of vague premonition about the beginning of a cycle as they do about the end? I mean, so in 2010, 2011, people saying, yeah, this is the beginning of the cycle. Or is it only at the end that people feel comfortable trying to make, probably 2 years?
Yeah. First off, if everyone knew where we were in the cycle, then cycles would cease to exist, right?
Yeah.
That being said, to answer your question, where are we in the cycle? It depends on the property type and the market. There are certainly markets where we're at peak, and I think you can probably guess which are those markets. They're pretty obvious, right? There are property types where we've probably hit peak. There are other property types where I think there's opportunity, and there's certainly markets that there's still opportunity, right? And so generally in real estate cycles, your primary markets are going to reach peak before your secondary and tertiary markets, and that's just simply because the money returns to real estate first to primary markets, and then as primary markets get overheated, they move to secondary and they move to tertiary, and that's a simplistic way of describing it, but that's essentially what happens. It's not quite so blanket where we are at peak or we're not, because it just depends. But yeah, I would say that pricing is reaching in most property types and most markets. It's kind of getting to a point where most of us are uncomfortable with valuations, and we don't, I shouldn't say we, I don't think that a lot of these valuations are durable. We're probably at peak in a lot of places.
Why is it then, do you think, and I don't disagree with that at all, why is it then that Sam Zell or somebody will say, I'm going to sell all these billions of dollars, and there are people who are willing to buy it? Because it's like, this is by definition the person you don't want to buy from, because they're timing this. They know they're not going to get any better price than this. Namely, you are going to pay them more than you would ever pay them at any other time. How does this tipping point happen? Why are some institutions willing to? Is it just you just have to keep buying?
Well, part of it's that you have capital, it needs to be deployed, and you want to deploy it in the wisest way possible, but you still need to deploy the capital. Another thing is everyone has a different investment criteria, and so you could have two people doing a deal, and both at the end of the day come out okay, even at peak, right?
Yeah.
And I believe it was Starwood that he did the deal with on that. At the end of the day, they could both be making a wise decision.
Portfolio-wise,
right? Because they have different investment criteria. They have different core competencies that would allow them maybe to take advantage of something that the other didn't didn't have the ability to take advantage of. So you can't always necessarily look at these deals and say, oh, Sam Zell, he always knows, and so he must be right here. Maybe he is right. Probably is. Usually is. But that's not necessarily say that Starwood is wrong. I think the broader point is, at times like this, yeah, you have to deploy capital and you want to be smart about it, but also people have different strengths, and you never know when they might be able to take a situation that you're incapable of finding more return out of, and because of some strength that they have in their organization or whatever it may be, extract more value out of that deal than you otherwise could have.